So one of the things that I said to Linda was, to have these kind of talks, and I'm trying to promote this sort of thing, seminar type talks throughout the retreats, because we seem to go to these and we build kites. You built my kites, all the invited guests, kites and so forth. But there's little talk about nuts and bolts. And every time I go to a retreat, not only I learn from you guys and I come up with new things, and today was no exception in my class, but the questions start flying. How do you frame? How do you bridle? How do you design? And design in particular. So I'd like to begin with saying the thumbprint is one of the things that always comes to question. How to develop a signature. I'm not an artist. That's what I usually hear. I said, you don't have to be an artist. In fact, most people in kiting might not be. There's a few. So it's a question of using images and knowing how to use them, making something rather than taking a flower or a picture of a cat or whatever it is that you like and putting it in the middle of a kite and boxing it in a square is perhaps only grabbing a part of that image and make it come out of a corner or the bottom. In other words, cropping a design. Enlarge the whole thing sufficiently so it really leaves the full screen. Let's say a rokaku. And I have a picture of you. Or if I draw a cartoon of you or a portrait of you. Now I want to put it on a kite, but I'm not going to put you in the middle of that kite. We're just not going to do that. I'm going to make it interesting. I'm going to provoke by making you like you're coming out of the corner of the kite instead, and only a part of you is visible. So if that illustrates what I'm talking about, is how we take something that's perhaps is not your own original art, even clip art, and make it interesting, make it your own, okay? How you work, how you develop your studio and your table where you work, and the style in which you work, such as what I do with the black lines and so forth, that didn't happen overnight. That's stuff that took a long, long time, 30 years of doing exactly the same thing and repeating it over and over and over. Then it becomes a natural thing. You don't even have to think about it. So when people come up and look at the work and they say, oh my God, look at this, it's so neat, and this, and the other, it happens no matter what. It just automatically happens because of the way I'm set up. So I'm saying you need to do the same thing and stick with it. That thumbprint, whatever it is, find something you like. Work, let's say, if you're from the Southwest, you could use native art from the Southwest. You could design it yourself, or you could take existing art and make it your own and milk it for all it's worth. I remember in the early days, Scott Hampton coming to my house for a week. We all are very familiar what he's doing and what he has been doing since then, and never ever deviates. I mean, we can look at 500 kites in the sky and we know which is the Scott Hampton kite, right? So he was showing me all these drawings and he wasn't all that excited. There was a lot of repetition, and I'm looking at this encyclopedia of designs and I'm just blown away by it. But he hadn't gotten out of his head yet. He's somewhere else, and I'm convincing him to take all this stuff and milk it for all it's worth. And that's exactly what's happened. Every design looks like a Scott Hampton no matter what. So he's taken this thing to the far, far, far limits. Anyone and everybody can do it. Let's just say a way to test, to change on how you think. Find a quote out of a book. Write a quote yourself, whether you're a poet or a writer or clever with words, a wordsmith, and build a kite representing that. It doesn't matter what other people think. What matters is that you're provoking someone to even ask the question, what is this? Oh, I built this kite on a quote. Whatever that quote is. That's another way of digging your soul out of yourself and putting it into a kite. And believe me, people will recognize it eventually, you know, that there's a lot of soul and heart in that work. So taking that idea and working it over and over again through the years will build you a body of work that everyone will recognize without question. In the early years, excited like everyone that comes into kiting and goes to, I remember going to Fort Worden and coming back from Fort Worden back in 1986 or 87, totally crazy and out of my mind. I had the skills, but I went to Fort Worden to learn how to make a good flying platform from all my peers, okay? Books and folders full of designs, which I showed to everybody, and they said, oh, this is great, whatever, whatever. I said, yes, I know, but I need to learn how to make this stuff fly, because so far, with my excitement, I'm making one of those. Typical new kite maker. You want to try a box kite, you want to try a figure kite, fly, whatever. All these different groups of kites, and try one of each. And some of it was working well, some of it was flying very marginally. So after a while, you get the admiration for the artwork, and you get the kudos for that, but then going out on a field and be seen by all your friends and hundreds of people struggling with a kite is not a whole lot of fun, okay? So the game was, okay, we need to concentrate on platforms that either I designed or existing forms, making them fly well, and then make the graphics and the art run rampant. And I had plenty of that, and still do. I have folders full of drawings that were designed 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and I haven't gotten around to them. So it's a deep pool. So just about everything is a derivative, really. The Chinese and the Japanese have been doing it for thousands of years. So that's another way that you can think on how to work. Taking the existing platforms, the things that are household names today in the kite world, change it, tweak it, change the angles, do something, make something different. The true name to a low aspect ratio kite, Japanese kite, is tametomo. That's the Japanese word for it. The word noodle came from a good friend of mine, Dale Vanderhoof, who's passed away a few years back, from Weed, California. I was on my way to OKR in Oregon, retreat, and we got stuck in a blizzard going over the pass, so I called him and said, come spend the night with us, and so we did. And he said, hey, let me see one of these skinny kites that you're promoting like crazy all over the place. I want to see what the story is. So I pulled one out, we put it together, and 2-3 weeks, he calls me and I said, I built a 20-footer. And the spine wasn't thick enough, wasn't stiff enough, and it looked like a noodle when I was bouncing it up and down. So I had to inform him that you do need a hefty spine to fly something like that. Otherwise it bends back so much that it won't retain, the stability that you need for that. For as complicated as it might look when I make diagrams on how it's doing, it's so easy. And it's something that starts from the bottom up. And it's a system that you can use on all kites because you're only adjusting one point. If I were to build a Japanese Edo, a rather large Edo kite, I can put cascade bridles on that too, but it's not traditional anymore. And so the true Japanese bridle is based on the same principle, for the exception that each section, each arm, each set of bridles is hooked, it's fixed, so it's hooked differently. This whole system is a sliding system to where you adjust only one point, and then everything else free floats. So the cascade bridle, what it is, it starts from the bottom. You can see what I call yokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It works the same way with 3 units, with 10 units, with 12 units. They get paired, and then you go single towards the top. And I can make schematics for you guys later, all the guys that are in class, whoever wants drawings on how this is done. I can sit down and sketch a few compositions, 3 units, 4 units, 5 units, 6 units, so you get an idea of how it works. So we start from the bottom. All these yolks are the same. The secondaries, which are these guys right here, these, of course, are not as long, but they can be the same, okay? So what we've done is we've paired the 2 lower ones with this guy with a sliding ring. That's free floating there. Let me show you on this one that's higher. You see that? It's not locked onto that ring. It's moving, okay? And so is that. So now we got those 2 pairs hooked together, and now we got a longer leg, and this one is sliding too, right here. And from this one, I'm connecting to the top and the toe point. Let's turn the kite sideways. So the toe point is here right now. If all of these were hooked individually, I'd be changing each and every knot to get this angle. Here's the toe point. I can keep going higher. You see how they're all following? It's all free floating. Let's go low now. Low toe point. One adjustment. If I want to fly this, I mean, it won't fly that low. But all you're doing is adjusting this. And of course, the standard pigtail, you slide it up and down, or a ring. And this is it to the Cascade bridle. The other thing that we do a lot with kites, and I think this will be of value to you, is I always put a weak point. See those strings up there? For instance, that one's broken. It doesn't have the slider anymore because I usually put sliders on both, but this broke on me. The kite came down or was taken down. So the first thing that breaks when this thing comes crashing into the ground are these strings. It's a weak point. Ferrules that are made out of thin aluminum, like arrow shafts, covered with heat shrink tubing to get rid of ugliness, let's just say. Those ferrules will break right at the seam between 2 sticks without breaking your sticks. So you build the kite and you put things into the kite so it's strong enough to support it. But when mayhem starts, your sticks won't go through the sails. Your tensioning devices will give, either explode or the string will break, and you can go back to camp and put a different slider, replace the string, retie it or whatever, but you're not losing your kite or having to go home and repair or find a way to fix a big hole somewhere in here because the spine snapped and went right through it. When I engineer structure, the bridles are always included in order to get away with the smallest, lightest, and strongest frame that I possibly can get by marrying the bridles properly to it. Does everybody understand what I mean by that? Support. Let's go back, let's say, to an Edo kite. It's got lots of sticks, and I mention these kites because it's a huge grid of sticks and so forth. There's a lot of structure in a kite like that. So they become very heavy, and they need a lot of wind. How do we get one to fly in lighter winds? Why do we have to wait until gale force winds comes to fly this giant carpet, this huge surface that should get up in the air just like that? You'd be surprised what you can get away with. I mean, there's bridles at every corner. As long as those are there, you could probably put a 10-foot Edo kite or a 15-foot Edo kite with 1,800 rods. I mean, small hollow tubes. You know, and then you have the 2 crosses that cross from corner to corner. You know, yeah, it's going to twist. It's going to look like a magic carpet on the ground, but once it goes up in the air and those bridles activate, it's going to sit up there solid. Now you're flying this monstrosity of a kite in 5-mile-an-hour winds because the frame is super, super, super light. Whenever I hand a set of sticks, let's just say a kite like the fish, you know, it's 5/8, it's almost an inch. You know, they look like broomsticks, but then you hand the whole set to somebody and you see how light it is. It's incredible and strong. I didn't invent these things for sure. There was people in Europe Some of the Italians, Tal Streeter, an American traveling the world, was doing these low aspect ratio kites, never realized that one of the Italian kite makers was actually making the kites for him for the exhibits. So I found the low aspect kite, or the Tametomo, rather fascinating, and discovered how well they flew in high winds, especially after flying cellular kites that are millions of sticks. You need a toolbox and a hard hat to assemble most of the times. They're not travel friendly, is what I'm trying to say. And then I discovered these things that I could make several and put them easily into the bag, and it's a one-stick kite. I can be in the sky with maybe 10 kites, I mean, very, very, very quickly, and still create a nice show. So I sort of became a pusher proponent of these type of kites until it caught on. Scott always made fun, oh, you're a skinny kite, you know, because he's building these huge surfaces, and here I am with this minimal stuff, you know. And then when people realized how well these things fly in high winds, then they started building them. And that's when Dale comes in with the noodle idea, and many others followed. All of a sudden they came into the market and everybody was building these kites. That's about the time I was kind of bailing out, moving on to something else. So that spark plug kite was the first project that I ever did without knowing that I was doing a low aspect ratio kite. I didn't know what that meant. That was way before Fort Worden, way before I met anyone, created in a complete vacuum in the living room of my house. It was a commission for the Laguna Seca Raceway in Monterey, California, by a friend of mine, someone who worked, a photographer who worked for Champion. And so we flew that kite during the 500, and I gotta tell you, I did that kite really, truly by the seat of my pants. You know, I had no idea that I was gonna go on and build things like this where I really knew what I'm doing with them. I really didn't. So what saved that was the artistic value, knowing how to shade something or how to make something look 3D and interesting. But that's about it. The techniques, I didn't have it. But we still ended up with something that flew, and it moved on from there. And I had some form of a cascade. They were all hooked together, so it was a pain in the neck to actually get that thing to fly until I learned the cascade. And here, just a couple of years ago, the gentleman who owned it wanted to sell it, even though it had been in my possession all that time since then, because I said I'm going to rework this kite and fix it, but never got around to it. So finally I did the sticks, I did the bridles, I put a cascade on it. Now this kite was flying phenomenal. Had I known that then, it would have been fantastic, but I didn't. I didn't know the cascade, I didn't know any of these things. Like I said, truly by the seat of my pants. I love it when people said, what's your favorite kite? The one I haven't built yet. Really, really. I hope to be able to do this until you know what freezes over. As long as I have the mind and the hands and the, you know, the willingness to keep going with this stuff. I got enough designs to really, truly, you know, last a lifetime actually. So, but I'm constantly learning. Coming to retreats like this is phenomenal. Today in my class, some people pointed out some things to me and I go, wow, maybe I'll start using those tools instead, you know. So every time without fail that happens. So keep that open mind all the time. Do not get into a box. Think out of the box if you possibly can. Think of ways to make your designs interesting and different. And if you're in search of that thumbprint, find that subject matter that you love so much, no matter what that is, and keep pushing it. Keep pushing it, pushing it. Pretty soon people say, oh yeah, that's a Barbara Myers thing. Oh, yeah. Kites came late. In terms of art, you mean, and other craft? Yes. Sculpting, glass blowing, pottery, woodwork, metal sculpture, music, which I still do.
So you've got a creative background.
Okay. I speak of that so much on interviews and, you know, all the stuff that's been going on lately, the interview with Ralph Dietrich and the Kite magazine and so forth and so on. It all comes from my parents. Okay, I accredit them constantly. I speak of my father constantly. My mother was a couture fashion designer. I watched her since I was a child sketch her collections, spring collections, summer collections, winter collections. I was there during some of the shows, the runway shows with the models. But I grew up next to my father's tilt table. He was a pretty well-known commercial artist in South America, but he was also a sculptor, painter, unbelievable photographer. In fact, one of the slides painting of my dad, the swan, I don't know if you guys, that looks like a photo. That's one of my dad's paintings. Not typical. He was a modernist. I grew up in a very modern, mid-century modern house, ceiling to floor glass and minimal art and marble floors. I mean, all that stuff was there for me, and that's what I grew up with. And so it definitely comes from there, That's the only thing that I can say. That the visual arts come into, it came kind of late actually when I started going back to that, because I remember drawing with my dad. I remember doing cartooning with my dad. I remember him teaching me how to paint with oils and all the crafts that he knew, how to take a good photograph and all these kinds of things. But I went music ways. Music and art major in high school, 3.5 years of college and university, didn't finish, crazy. Schooling and art will polish your craft, but there are certain things that a university could not teach you, So, it comes from something bigger and deeper, So yeah, the background is definitely there. I grew up with it, so it's easy for me to do this kind of stuff. On some things I use hardware, and some I'm trying to get rid of it actually. I'll make it simpler. But some stuff is pretty cool, and if it's useful, I'll make a fitting or we'll use a part if it has at least a minimum of 3 different uses in that kite. Otherwise, to me, it's nonsense to put all that hardware in the kite. There was one time when all of us OD'd on the fittings. It was popular in the competitions. Everybody was looking at all this machine stuff, and man, pretty soon everybody's just overloading the kites with these things that turn and spin, and like I said, stuff that you need a hard hat and a toolbox to put together, and it's overdone. It's still a kite. So you can get away with shelf parts, simple things. There's certain kites, for instance, I won't put my typical slider in the back to bow the kite. Use a knot instead. Reduce the weight, it's cleaner. The kite looks better without that particular kite looks better without these objects all over the place. So it's a mixed bag of things, So yes, there's been also a lifetime of searching for Cindy Thrall calls it fiddle bits. You're the fiddle bit guy. Whatever she meant by that. Because she sees all these cool little parts and things like that, but they're there for a reason, and I use them if they're useful and they serve a purpose. Otherwise, a pocket is fine, or a simple end cap is just fine. Most of the stuff that I put on there, I don't machine anymore. It's stuff that I can make on a drill press. You can take a drill press and literally turn it into a milling machine by buying a milling machine vise, which moves and spins. So now instead of doing a sideways thing like a lathe, you're working your part upright like a miller, because you're able to change the angles. But end caps and all these other things you can make on the drill press. Sometimes I have to make them because of the size, like you see there. But all of the stuff there, those are all Jayco or some other shelf part that's readily available. As time goes on, you get lazy. You don't want to make stuff. You want to make kites. You don't want to spend time machining parts. Little things that come into play, and it's a constant thing. Whether it's, with bridles, design, shapes, fittings, not fittings. But staying with it at all costs. Never stopping. And that's what I say, never stop. Do not stop making kites. Just keep going. Keep developing the craft, for those of you who have not been doing it for so long. There's many of you here that have been doing it for a long time, but Keep going. Do not stop. Any questions?